What if toppling a tyrant leads not to freedom, but to fire? The deserts of Libya have always been unforgiving, scorched by the sun and stripped of mercy by the wind. They stretch endlessly, a sea of heat and silence that seems immune to change. And yet, in the year 2011, the desert did change. It burned. What began as a protest, a cry for housing, for dignity, for life beyond dictatorship became something far more volatile. It became a revolution. It became a war. It became the beginning of something no one could fully control. Not the rebels, not the West, and certainly not the man who had ruled Libya for over 4 decades. Muammar Gaddafi, once the iron-fisted architect of a so-called People's Republic, would soon be dragged from a ditch and executed by his own people. But what if that death wasn't the end of tyranny, but the start of something worse? Because in the brutal story of Libya's 2011 revolution of hope, betrayal, foreign bombs, and fractured dreams, we find no easy heroes, only a brutal truth. That sometimes, in the name of liberation, nations are broken more than they are rebuilt. And the question still echoes today, what truly happened in Libya, and did the world make it worse? Libya is a paradox wrapped in dunes. Over 90% of this vast North African country is desert. And yet, beneath that sand lies one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. For centuries, Libya was little more than a forgotten corner of Empire Ottoman, then Italian. But in 1951, it emerged from colonialism as an independent kingdom under King Idris, a monarch who was traditional, pro-Western, and profoundly regional in his loyalties. His regime's wealth came not from its people, but from the black gold bubbling beneath them. Oil changed everything. With billions of petrodollars flooding in, Libya ons destitute became rich, but the people remained poor. The wealth, like the king's favor, flowed toward his own tribe, his own region, his own comfort. Outside Tripoli and Benghazi, rural and tribal communities watched this transformation with growing resentment, and in the shadow of that resentment, a new figure began to rise. In 1969, a 27-year-old army officer named Muammar Gaddafi led a coup that overthrew the king, declaring a new Libyan Arab Republic. He promised unity, dignity, and independence. At first, many believed him. Then came the truth. Muammar Gaddafi did not simply take power. He became the state. In the name of Jamahiriya, a so-called state of the masses, he dissolved parliaments, banned parties, and rewrote governance as a direct rule by the people, but only as he defined them. Opposition meant death. Power flowed not through institutions but kinship, favor, and fear. Loyal tribes were rewarded, others were suppressed. His ideology was a strange blend of Arab nationalism, socialism, and delusion outlined in his Green Book, which declared, "Representation is fraud." He nationalized oil, expelled foreign companies, and used Libya's wealth to fund an elaborate system of patronage at home and terror abroad. Gaddafi sponsored insurgents from Ireland to Chad, armed terrorists in Europe, and was implicated in the Lockerbie bombing that killed 270 people. By the 1980s, the world saw Libya as a rogue state. By the 1990s, it saw it as a pariah. But the sands shift with time. After years of sanctions, isolation, and the fall of Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi reversed course. In the early 2000s, he surrendered his nuclear ambitions, paid reparations for past attacks, and reopened ties with the West. Leaders shook his hand. Oil contracts flowed, But the damage was already done not to Western trust, but to Libya's soul, because beneath the surface, a nation was rotting. While Libya's GDP per capita soared past $16,000, most citizens were trapped in a bloated public sector. Unemployment among youth neared 30%. Housing was scarce. Corruption was endemic. And while Gaddafi posed on international stages, his people seethed in silence. Then, in late 2010, Tunisia exploded, and the flames crossed the border. It started, as revolutions often do, with something small. In February 2011, a human rights lawyer was arrested in Benghazi. Within hours, thousands had taken to the streets. They demanded housing. They demanded dignity. They demanded something more than Gaddafi's empty billions. Security forces responded with bullets. Over 230 civilians were killed in the first days. The protests became an uprising. From the east in Cyrenaica, long resentful of Gaddafi's dominance, military units began to defect. His own interior minister abandoned him, taking weapons and command authority with him. By late February, Benghazi and much of eastern Libya were under rebel control. A National Transitional Council (NTC) was formed, a rival government claiming to represent the Libyan people. For a moment, hope flickered, but Gaddafi wasn't finished. From his fortified compound in Tripoli, Muammar Gaddafi prepared for war. This was not a man inclined toward graceful exits. His regime had survived coups, sanctions, and international airstrikes. He had outlasted Reagan, Thatcher, and the Soviet Union. He believed he would outlast this rebellion, and he still held cards. While Libya's Eastern Army units had defected, Gaddafi's core military strength had never rested in conventional forces. It rested in tribal militias, loyal units, personally commanded by his sons, cousins, and longtime tribal allies. To them, Gaddafi's survival wasn't political. It was existential. Their loyalty would be brutal and swift. First, dissent in Tripoli was crushed. Then came Misrata, Libya's third largest city and a key rebel stronghold near the capital. Gaddafi's forces surrounded the city and unleashed a storm of artillery and rockets. The port, Misrata's only lifeline, was shelled into silence. Snipers, tanks, and grad rockets turned neighborhoods into rubble. It was urban warfare at its most savage. To some, Misrata became Libya's Stalingrad. To others, it was the place where Gaddafi's image as an invincible strongman began to unravel. Because as the dictator advanced, so did the world's scrutiny. In Benghazi, the National Transitional Council was under siege diplomatically, militarily, existentially. If Gaddafi recaptured the city, the rebellion would collapse. So the rebels turned outward to NATO, to the Arab League, to the United Nations. They called not for ground troops, but for air power, a no-fly zone to stop Gaddafi's MiGs from strafing civilians. On the 12th of March, a diplomatic breakthrough. The Arab League officially requested a no-fly zone over Libya, even Syria, then ruled by Bashar al-Assad, voted yes. Such was the hatred for Gaddafi. Days later, as Gaddafi's tanks rolled toward Benghazi, he gave a chilling speech on television. We will come house by house, room by room, closet by closet. No mercy. That same night, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing military force to protect civilians by any means necessary. 2 days later, on the 19th of March, warplanes filled the Libyan sky. Operation Odyssey Dawn had begun, French jets struck first, destroying armored columns outside Benghazi. Soon, American cruise missiles smashed air defense sites. Over the next 10 days, more than 1,000 sorties flew against Gaddafi's forces. Libya's skies were no longer his. But there was a catch. The resolution forbade foreign troops from entering Libya. If Gaddafi was to be overthrown, the Libyans themselves would have to do it. So a new phase began, one even more chaotic. The world would not send soldiers, but it sent something else. Weapons, training, advisors, and money. Qatar, a tiny Gulf kingdom, became one of the NTC's most aggressive supporters, funneling over 20 knots of Devon. 0 tons of arms into the conflict. Rumors swirled that Qatari special forces even fought on the front lines. Sudan, long bitter over Gaddafi's interference in Darfur, opened its airspace and sent heavy arms across the desert. Western nations trained rebel fighters in Tunisia and provided battlefield intelligence. By May 2011, the rebels held Misrata barely. Then came the Nafusa Mountains in the west. Long home to marginalized Berber tribes, these rugged peaks became a new front. Rebels, now battle-hardened and better supplied, launched an offensive toward Tripoli. Their goal: surround the capital from the west, while building a rebellion from within. In Tripoli itself, clandestine cells began to smuggle arms, recruit fighters, and sabotage checkpoints. Gaddafi's regime responded with brutal crackdowns, house raids, arrests, executions. The city became a tinderbox, and in August, the spark hit. The rebels stormed the capital, but instead of meeting resistance, they found emptiness. Gaddafi's army had melted away. His cousin, in charge of defending the city's western approach, had defected, ordering loyalists to lay down arms. Tripoli fell within 2 days. Gaddafi was gone, but he was not yet dead. After Tripoli fell, Muammar Gaddafi became a man on the run. For over 4 decades, he had ruled Libya with an iron grip, branding himself not just as a leader, but as the guide of the revolution, the brother leader, the king of kings of Africa, the voice of the desert tribes. But now, that voice was silent. Cornered and stripped of power, Gaddafi fled to his birthplace, the coastal city of Sirte, nestled between Tripoli and Benghazi. The city became his last bastion. Rebel forces surrounded it, but Gaddafi's loyalists dug in. They weren't just defending a city, they were defending a myth, the man who had once promised to unite Arabs, defy the West, and build a third universal theory that would change the world. But the world had moved on. Foreign airstrikes pounded Sirte. Rebel infantry pressed forward house by house. What began as a national uprising had narrowed to a brutal urban siege. Gaddafi tried to escape. On the 20th of October, a convoy of black SUVs attempted to flee the city, but NATO surveillance had already marked him. A French Mirage jet dropped a precision-guided bomb. Moments later, rebel forces on the ground closed in. Gaddafi was found hiding in a drainage culvert, wounded, disoriented, and pleading for his life. What followed remains disputed. What is known is this: he was beaten, humiliated, and shot dead. No trial, no ceremony, no final speech. The brother leader, who once proclaimed himself immortal, was dragged into the dust by the very people he claimed to liberate. History is filled with the fall of tyrants. But what follows the fall, that is where the real test begins. In Libya, The collapse of Gaddafi did not mark the end of dictatorship. It marked the collapse of an entire political ecosystem built on personal loyalty, repression, and oil. Without it, there was no scaffolding left, just raw power, tribal mistrust, and flooded armories. Even the most well-meaning revolutionaries were soon pulled into local rivalries. Ideology gave way to identity. Politics gave way to proxy war. And so, the revolution that had begun with a cry for dignity descended into a struggle for dominance. Western powers, having played a decisive role in toppling Gaddafi, now found themselves uncertain. What came next was never planned. No Marshall Plan. No unified rebuilding effort. Only cautious diplomacy. Sanctions and arms embargoes which were ignored. The state unraveled further. In 2020, a fragile ceasefire was negotiated, but by then, Libya had already been divided for nearly a decade. Tripoli and Tobruk, militias and foreign troops, oil fields and black markets. Every layer of Libyan society became politicized. Tribal councils, municipal leaders, clerics, businessmen. Trust was gone. Even efforts by the United Nations to bring all sides to the table were marred by infighting. Peace conferences were held in Berlin, Geneva, Paris, far from the broken streets of Benghazi or Misrata. But on the ground, ordinary Libyans were tired. Tired of war, tired of waiting, tired of promises that always seemed to arrive too late. And yet, somehow, the country endures. There is no single Libya today. There is the Libya of the oil terminals, still pumping billions of dollars into a central bank with no central authority. The Libya of warlords and gunmen, where power is measured in checkpoints and Kalashnikovs. The Libya of smugglers, ferrying migrants across the Mediterranean, some of whom never reached the shore. And the Libya of families who light candles for the dead and still believe their country can rise from the ashes. Gaddafi is gone, but his shadow lingers not in statues or slogans, but in the structure of the state he built to collapse without him. He believed that without him, Libya would descend into chaos. And in a tragic way, he was right. But history is not a circle. It is a spiral always repeating, but never quite the same. The Arab Spring once seemed like a wind of change. Now, in the deserts of Libya, it feels like a distant storm that passed too quickly and left a whirlwind in its wake. The question now is not whether Gaddafi was a villain. That is settled. The question is whether the post-Gaddafi generation born of war, loss, and hope can forge something better. Not imposed, not imported, but Libyan. In 2011, the world cheered as Gaddafi fell. Freedom had triumphed. We were told dictators had learned they were not invincible. But more than a decade later, Libya is not free. It is not united, and it is not at peace. Perhaps it never truly was, as foreign mercenaries still patrol oil fields and rival factions squabble over electoral laws. One truth remains. The revolution was real. So were the hopes, but no one told Libya what would happen after the cheering stopped. And so the question lingers in every ruined town, every exile's memory, and every whispered conversation beneath the desert moon. Was it worth it? Or did Libya simply trade one set of chains for another newer, more invisible, but no less binding? History doesn't answer. It only waits, and Libya is still writing its final chapter